This is the United States of America. The USA is a settler colonial state. What this means, in short, is that it was founded by people who moved from elsewhere to live on land that they'd stolen from the indigenous inhabitants who already lived there. In the case of the USA, many of these white European settlers came to form a social, economic, and political elite. In the process of this, they enslaved many people, predominantly Africans. They justified this slavery and the theft of native land with the idea that they were superior. Today, the US population is made up of people from many different backgrounds. That someone is American does not automatically imply that they are a part of any particular racial or ethnic group, or that they have much in common with one another in terms of economic or political interests. For example, they might be a black descendant of slaves. They might be native and descended from people who were mass murdered for their land. On average, those people still endure many disadvantages from the atrocities that were committed against their ancestors. Or they might be white and literally be descended from the people who owned said slaves and stole said land. On average, these people inherited many advantages from their ancestors, and today they're still dominant socially, economically, and politically. Many of them also still believe themselves to be superior. There's of course other groups into which Americans are commonly categorized. Among them, for example, Arabs or Asians. Another very prominent one of these groups is Latinos. What is a Latino? Well, it's someone from Latin America, which in Latin America itself is commonly considered to consist of these countries. These countries are also all settler colonial states. White European settlers violently stole the land from its previous inhabitants and formed a social, political, and economic ruling class. They enslaved many people, both African and indigenous, and justified it all with the idea that they were superior. Today, the Latin American population is made up of people from many different backgrounds. That someone is Latin American does not automatically imply that they're from any particular ethnic or racial group, or that they have much in common with one another in terms of political or economic interests. For example, they might be black and descended from slaves. They might be native and descended from people who were enslaved and mass murdered for their land. On average, those people still endure many disadvantages from the atrocities that were committed against their ancestors. Or they might be white settlers, literally descended from the people who owned said slaves and stole said land. On average, these people inherited many advantages from their ancestors, and as a result, they're still dominant socially, economically, and politically today. There's also other groups of Latin Americans, among them, for example, Arabs and Asians, and each and every one of these groups is just as Latino as each other. Do you maybe see the problem here? In Latin America itself, the idea of Latino as some sort of special group of people isn't really a thing. It's just used as a simple shorthand for Latin American, meaning pertaining to the region. It's not an identity category, nor can it be pinned down to any specific languages or cultures. There are huge cultural differences between Latin American people and nations, and indigenous people who don't speak a Latin-derived language are still considered Latin Americans, because they're still from the region. It's therefore a geographical concept based simply on the fact that the Spanish and Portuguese empires happened to colonize these places. That someone is Latino doesn't tell you anything beyond the fact that they happen to be from one of said places. You can see this on the Spanish language version of Wikipedia. Wikipedia is obviously not an objective source for anything, but I'm not using it as such. I just think that it reflects how people in Latin America understand the term. The only page on using Latino to refer to a group of people today is specifically about the way the term is used in the USA, because it's so weird and foreign to most Latin Americans that they need it explained. Aside from that, you're just directed to the page for the region of Latin America. No specific articles about Latino people. And this makes perfect sense because, as was stated in the intro, Latin American countries have had immigration from practically the world over, as well as some pretty sordid histories of racial oppression, just like the USA. So simply grouping everyone from Latin America together without accounting for any of these differences would be pretty absurd, right? You'd just be ignoring present-day racism and the legacy of colonialism, and it would be absurd to do the same in the USA as well. And yet, in the USA, this is exactly what's done for Latinos. Through this term and its trusty synonym, Hispanics, they're constantly grouped together without any regard for those factors, and it's completely nonsensical. A great example is how in 2020, the US media was just utterly perplexed as to why so many Latino voters in Florida swung towards Donald Trump in the election. After all, Latinos are people of color, right? They're an oppressed minority group, right? And such minorities generally lean heavily towards the Democrats, while white people vote more for the Republicans. This Reuters article on the matter even explicitly categorizes these Latinos as non-white. But if we look at census data, we can see that the vast majority of Latinos in Florida are actually white, with 82% of them identifying as such. Now, this number is probably a bit inflated. Darker-skinned Latin American people sometimes choose to identify as white when prompted to, due to social stigmas, or because they just feel that such surveys don't really give them an option that more accurately describes how they self-identify. And the US Census is terrible in this respect, as it fails to give them any sort of category which they might identify with more, like mestizo for example, a very common term in Latin America to refer to people who are visibly of mixed indigenous and European heritage. The US Census is notoriously awful for this, as it only offers them the amazing options of white or some other race. But even if we try to account for that and say that maybe 20% of these white identifying Latinos could possibly be described as mestizo, which I think is probably a bit of an exaggeration, you're still looking at more than 60% white people. So the answer to the question of why so-called Latinos in Florida leaned more towards the Republican Party than was expected in the 2020 election seems kind of obvious, right? Most of them are white. They have the same privileges and the same interests as other white people do on average, and that they or their ancestors happened to move to the USA didn't magically just strip all of that from them and turn them into an oppressed group of people of color. And so they're inclined to vote much along the same lines as many other white people do. Simple. Of course, there's other factors at play here too, like the fact that Miami is home to most of Latin America's most prominent right-wing propagandists, as well as many of its richest and widest elites, who tend to be quite a bit further to the right than even Donald Trump. But I think those things just drive the point home further. You can see the distinction between white and non-white Latinos very clearly in the US National Census data for median household income. White households have a median income of almost $70,000 per year. But if you remove Hispanic identifying whites from that equation and only count other whites, it doesn't increase by any meaningful amount. It only goes up by 2.6%. This shows that, on average, white Latinos earn incomes that are for all intents and purposes equal to those of other whites, while non-white Latinos earn far less than them. Actually, significantly less than what the census indicates here, as those higher earning white Latinos are driving up the overall number for Hispanics. I wouldn't be surprised if the earnings of non-white Hispanics are actually closer to those of black people. Even without that more precise data though, this still shows clearly that white Latinos enjoy all of the socioeconomic privileges that other white people do, and don't endure systemic discrimination, while non-white Latinos clearly do, and likely to a much higher degree than is usually assumed, as non-white Latinos are skewing the statistics greatly. And I mean, yeah, obviously, we're talking about a group of people who reap the benefits of mass oppression, dispossession, and slavery. So of course the people who they dispossessed, massacred, and enslaved are gonna be disadvantaged today. It's completely absurd to group all of these people together. A rich white Latino and a poor black or brown one have about as much in common as like a white stock photo family and a black family from the projects. And that's why a lot of Latin American people on the outside looking in are just utterly confused with the USA's obsession with trying to make Latinos some sort of special identity category. All it does is allow a subset of white people to appropriate the struggles of a subset of non-white people and act like they're some sort of marginalized minority themselves, when they're so obviously not. Now, some people would argue that, but some racists in the USA don't consider white Latinos to be white. And my response to that is, Well, firstly, it's just not even true. American racists have a racialized idea of what constitutes a Latino, which is heavily based on physical characteristics. They incorrectly envision that term to mean a brown, mestizo, or indigenous person. It's very unlikely that they would even be able to distinguish that a white Latino is actually a Latino, or that they'd even consider them as such. Just like how they probably wouldn't have many good things to say if you asked them what they thought of Africans, but that would all probably be thrown out the door if they met a white South African. Secondly, even if we accept that premise, and I reiterate that it's just bullshit, so what? Clearly, white Latinos don't experience anything resembling the systemic racism that non-white Latinos do. They can't be identified as the other and be discriminated against based off looks. In fact, I 100% guarantee you that the average American racist wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them and like a white French or Italian or Spanish person. They'd just be like, they're speaking another language or they're speaking with an accent. That makes me angry. It would be much more akin to xenophobia than anything resembling racial or ethnic discrimination. It's not anything unique to them being Latinos. And I mean, even if it was, hypothetically, we'd be talking about a conflict between two groups of white settler colonists whose countries were all built on slavery, dispossession, massacres, etc. Giving any credence to this notion at all is just absurd. I'm sure they'd actually all get along really well if they just stopped and had a chat. They'd find a lot of common ground on the racism front actually. That's why in the past they did actually get along really well. The prime example of this is the southern USA's historical relationship with Cuba, which happens to be where much of Florida's white Latino population comes from. Cuba was quite possibly the worst slave colony in the entire Americas, and that's saying a lot. In 1841, 43% of the population of Cuba were slaves, a far higher proportion than that of the USA, even during the peak of slavery there. The entire island was basically just one giant plantation, where white Latino slave owners and their descendants became impossibly rich off owning and working human beings. As you might expect then, Cuba resisted the abolition of slavery very, very bitterly, and only ended up doing so in 1886. Just 73 years before the Cuban Revolution of 1959. Americans in the slave-owning South took notice of Cuba outslaving them, and in 1854 they drafted a plan to annex Cuba so that the US could have another slave state. The proposal made it all the way to the president of the time, and likely would have been carried out if it had not been exposed beforehand. Now look, obviously all of this is a bit simplified. Not every white Latin American is literally directly descended from a slaver, just like every white US American isn't. But they still enjoy all the privileges associated with being white while living in a society literally built on land stolen from and the slavery of non-white people. And them moving to the USA doesn't magically change that and turn them into some oppressed group of people of color. I also just want to address something that I've seen some Americans say, which is that for these very reasons that I've covered, white people should not be considered Latino, but that's just as stupid. Latino just means Latin American, and obviously white people can be Latin Americans. Last I checked, there's more than 100 million of them. The solution is not to overcompensate for the fact that people in the USA have given the label undue prominence by trying to turn it into something exclusively for people of color. Latino is simply not an ethnicity or a race, so stop acting like it is and stop trying to make it one. You can be white and Latino, you can be anything in Latino, and that's fine. In conclusion, Latinos are just as diverse as the rest of the US population is as a whole, so putting so much importance on the term and trying desperately to racialize and ethnicize it is no less stupid than grouping all of the people in the USA together and just pretending that there's no subset of the population that, on average, live starkly different realities to others. Every time that you guys are like, oh look, there's finally a Latino represented in this high position or whatever, and then it's just a white guy whose rich family left Cuba aged 1 and then raised him in Beverly Hills? Beverly Hills 90210. Literally, everyone else just rolls their eyes and collectively groans. Please stop. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, subscribe for more. And if you really liked it, maybe consider supporting me on Patreon, sending me a one-time tip on Ko-fi, or becoming a member on YouTube. On my Patreon, you can get some nice rewards like previews of my videos, access to monthly updates and Q&As, and your name in the credits like you see here. Now I'd just like to thank all of my patrons, and especially my $25 plus patrons: A Big Mean Cat, Potte, Dusty, Mischief and Fins, Evan Carroll, Jel Cribson, Ferta Han, Benny G, Darcius B, Jesse Hosick, Shab, Brosnan, and my $10 plus patrons: Morimer, Jackie T, Cab the Burdened One, Cincione Bresgal, Gilles Alcoin, Artemio Nelson, Jacob Pitts, Insurgente, Industrial Robot, Young Trotsky, Mamushin, Eleanor Taylor, Oroja, Jesse Zaleski, Crouton and Baguette, JG, Nico Del Sesto, One Trash Boy, Christopher Strom, and Michael Strauss. That's all. See you next time.